1941. 24 hours after the date that will live in infamy, the nation assembled to hear their commander-in-chief.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Bombs from enemy planes had finally brought national unity. Fortunately, to lead the war effort, we had men like Mr. Robert Lovett, Assistant Secretary of War for Air, Judge Robert Patterson, Under-Secretary of War, Chief of the Army Air Forces, General Henry Arnold, heading a staff which included Carl Spaatz, James Doolittle, Ira Aker, and Hoyt Vandenberg, among others. And one of America's leading advocates for expanded air power, Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He checked U.S. outposts like General Frank Andrews' Caribbean Defense Command. In charge of Army forces in the Far East was the man who had helped us establish the GHQ Air Force, General Douglas MacArthur. Now he consulted with Manuel Quezon, President of the Philippines. Together they had kept the island secure after a week of heavy bombing by the Japanese. Mac's men, close to a knockout, rolled with a punch.
Not so at Clark Field. Here, despite a 9-hour warning, half our total bombing force was lost on the ground. But this didn't stop the Far East Air Force on emergency fields from wiring its planes together to fight what was destined to be a losing battle. Fighter pilots like Joseph Moore, Grant Mahoney, and Samuel Merritt fought a delaying action. Never knowing if their temporary bases would be safe for return, they prepared to engage the enemy. A few B-17s that escaped destruction joined the fight. Distinguishing themselves were bomber pilots Rosie O'Donnell, Hewitt Wheelis, and Kelly. That's Captain Colin Kelly. His fortress had been directed to locate and sink a carrier. Instead, a Jap heavy cruiser was spotted. A warship made a good target for Kelly's bombardier, Meyer 11. The bombs damaged and stopped the warship.
Colin Kelly's life came to a hero's end that morning. Meyer 11's luck ran out over New Guinea a year later. And despite the heroic sacrifices of men like Kelly and Levin, the Japs finally drove the Allies out of the Philippines. In Australia, where we had to concentrate our limited air strength after retreating from the islands, our job was to stop the Japs from sweeping over all the Pacific. With this in mind, we had to deploy our forces for the defense of Australia early in 1942. That's why General Ralph Royce, Chief of Pacific Air Staff, piloted his new boss, General George Brett, Chief of Allied Air Forces in the Pacific, on an aerial inspection tour. General Brett decided his air units must encompass the entire continent of Australia.
All this time, there was an American volunteer group in Asia. Here, Special Advisor to the Chinese Air Force, Claire Chennault, had 84 volunteer pilots, including men such as Tex Hill, George Burgard, and Robert Smith. Nicknamed the Flying Tigers, their P-40 Tomahawks were serviced by Chinese mechanics and 200 American ground crewmen. Along with official sanction, the former Army, Navy, and Marine pilots were offered $600 per month and the promise of a bonus for every Jap plane destroyed. A few days after Pearl Harbor, the Flying Tiger 1st and 2nd Squadrons moved to Kunming. There, Chennault set up a fighter control headquarters, hooked into an elaborate air warning net to receive reports from Chinese aircraft spotters. The Japanese, based at Hanoi, 60 miles away, headed for Kunming to destroy the untried Tigers who had arrived only the day before. The moment the Jap flight was airborne, a sharp-eyed Chinese spotter ran to flash the warning. Crude red lantern semaphores sent the signal over the hills. Kunming had experienced many false alerts, but this report of heavy engine noise at station X10 was the real thing. Fighter control added up the enemy course and placed them 50 miles east of Kunming. This was the decisive moment. The Tigers weren't going to lose any planes on the ground. Kunming wasn't going to be another Pearl Harbor or Clark Field. Japs were about to feel the bite of these razor-teethed tiger sharks, terrifying emblem of the flying tigers. And so, American pilots in American planes, aided by a primitive Chinese warning system, were about to tackle a formation of the Imperial Japanese Air Force, which was then victoriously sweeping the Pacific skies. Part of the fate of China was riding in the P-40 cockpits as Robert Sandel's first squad made contact with the enemy. After losing 60% of their force in this one fight, the Japs never again tried to bomb Kunming. Chennault's handful of flying tigers were our only fighting airmen in China. And like the Lafayette Escadrille in World War I, they made us proud.
But for global war, we needed men, thousands of skilled men. Some had to become bombardiers and learn the intricacies of complex gadgets like the secret bomb sights. Working mock-ups, machine guns mounted on platforms and trucks, trained gunners to draw a bead on a flashing target. Then the training took to the skies. Behind each gun were men, and behind each man was months of training. The lives of a crew were going to depend on the accuracy of the gunner. By February 1942, tail guns were filling the blind spot that lost us Colin Kelly. The Axis took 10 years to build their air forces. America had to do it in one, and at the same time, hold off the enemy.
On the President's order, the bitter taste of war was returned to Japan. We fashioned a daring scheme to have the Hornet launch a force of bombers and strike at Tokyo from the sea. All the volunteers for this secret and hazardous job had been specially trained by Colonel Jimmy Doolittle. While under destroyer escort, the 80 Tokyo Raiders held a deck ceremony with Japanese medals. Doolittle fastened one of these to a 500-pound bomb. The medals were going to be returned with interest. Lashed to the flight deck, the 16 B-25s had a rough voyage. Hoping to reach a takeoff point 450 miles from Japan, but ready to start in event of discovery, the crews kept fit. They were discovered. After avoiding 2 enemy patrol vessels, the task force realized they were sighted by a Japanese picket boat. The Hornet's escort promptly sank. Since secrecy had been compromised and fearing an alarm all over Japan, Doolittle, forced into the decision, ordered the planes to be launched. This was 800 instead of 450 miles from Tokyo, and 10 hours earlier than planned. In spite of the last-second change, preparations went according to rehearsal. Only 467 feet of clear deck faced Doolittle's lead ship. The rest barely had room in which to rev up, and the last plane hung precariously out over the stern of the Hornet. After the wind-up by the flight officer, Doolittle made his run down the plunging deck. With 100 feet to spare, he led the parade. Tension eased a little once the colonel was in the air. crewmen cheered as one plane after another screamed down the swaying runway. In the excitement, this pilot started without lowering his flaps. His plane ran off the deck, dropped sharply, but expert piloting saved it. Launching fully loaded medium bombers had never been done before. When the decks of the flagship were cleared, Admiral Halsey signaled, "To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command, good luck and God bless you."
Tokyo, oddly enough, had just completed an air raid drill. Their patrol boat had warned the city, but the attack was expected the next day. Therefore, the Jap war machine rolled on, unmindful of the approaching eagles. Target factories were turning out munitions tagged for Corregidor, Midway, and Dutch Harbor. Secure behind their Pacific fortress and confident of an early victory, they discounted America's ability to fight back.
Thus, the bombers were virtually unopposed as they flew on the deck. They swept in over the coast on their way to Tokyo. Elements separated and some climbed to 1,500 feet for the bombing. At 12:15, the attack was opened by Doolittle, who dove in before he unloaded his incendiaries upon the Japanese capital. One after another, they checked off their targets. Tank factory, shipyard, docks, railroad yards, steel plant, gunpowder factory.
As the raiders left Tokyo with a broad trail of flame and smoke in their wake, Japan tasted war. The raid was but an omen of the eventual destruction to be heaped on Japan from the skies. As Doolittle later promised,
"We're going back to Tokyo, and we shall go in full array and with mighty allies."
Spring 1942. The Axis was winning the war, and the Allies faced their gravest crisis as Nazi and Japanese officers met in Germany. If their victories continued, and as yet there was no force to stop them, the Axis powers hoped their armies would victoriously meet in Asia, just as their tacticians met for maneuvers. Each greedy for immediate conquests, they planned to completely dominate the world. In those black days of 1942, German armies and air forces pushed toward Japan. Relentlessly, the gigantic Axis pincers were threatening to close in Central Asia.
That's why American industry doubled and quadrupled its war effort. There was definite hope for victory, provided the British and Russian people could give the United States time to supply our allies and time to build an air force which could smash the Axis pincers. It wasn't long, and the Truman Committee was able to state, "We have succeeded in building up an air industry in the U.S. which our foes cannot hope to equal."
But planes alone were not enough, and so specialized training began in 1942 under the watchful eye of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He saw the 82nd Airborne Flying Foot Soldiers change from a brave dream into a deadly fighting machine under command of General Matthew Ridgway. The 1st Air Troop Carrier Unit had been set up by the AAF to work with paratroopers. The amazing success of the Germans had awakened belated American interest in vertical envelopment, which means landing a combat force behind enemy lines. Reliable C-47s were quickly boarded by the shock troops who were going to spearhead the way for a glider army which would follow. They were about to test tactical principles in North Carolina before going overseas to help blunt the Axis pincers. For all the great airborne operations of the war, American troop carrier men and planes provided most of the lift. There was nothing new about an airborne army. Billy Mitchell had received approval for such an operation during World War I. But even he never dreamed of entire armies filling the skies. In theory, the American paratroopers dropped on surprise defenders and seized bridgeheads for the gliders.
On other airfields, towcraft, modified C-47 sky trains, hitched on troop carrier gliders which were loaded and ready. Nylon, the new strong synthetic, was science's answer to the tow rope problem. Once hooked together, the transport towed the glider into position for the takeoff run. This made room for another sky train. On a split-second schedule, they were like so many locomotives taking on freight cars. Some sky trains hauled double freights. Taxiing at full throttle, the tow planes had to remain on the ground until the ton-and-a-half gliders were airborne. Once over the drop zone, glider pilots cut their ships loose to play their special part in the pattern of attack. Banking sharply away, they dove for the ground. Quickest possible landing kept the unarmed gliders from being easy game for enemy fighters. As more cut loose and headed down to the spinning earth, the glider army joined the paratroopers who had set up points of resistance. Thus, the AAF gave the infantry wings, and the weapon, vertical envelopment, became a reality.
Another weapon in America's arsenal for global war was the skill and experience of our great commercial airlines operating under contract to the War Department. July 1942, this ferrying service was reorganized as the Air Transport Command under veteran flyer General Harold George. In the company of C.R. Smith, his deputy, they inspected new installations. By summer, ATC routes touched all 6 continents. The growth of the Air Transport Command closely paralleled the expansion of the Air Force itself. In less than 2 years, sky bridges connected practically every corner of the world. ATC skywagons, guided by the Army Airways communication system, crossed the Atlantic on an average of 1 every 13 minutes. The broader Pacific, every hour and a half. And so ATC, by supplying both men and machines to world battlefronts, was preparing to smash the Axis threat.
During these critical early days, the Navy succeeded in breaking the Japanese secret code. On May 15th, Navy intelligence officers intercepted an important communication. It was the detailed Jap plan to attack Midway and points in the Aleutians with an invasion army supported by a tremendous task force. But if the Japs knew that we had broken their code, this could have been a wild goose chase or a trap. The Army and Navy decided to gamble. If we could intercept the Jap Navy at Midway, the payoff was too great to overlook. And so the call went out. ATC had to deliver reinforcements, bombs and ammunition to the Aleutians and B-17s to Midway. The Hawaiian Department had to beg, borrow, and steal these bomber aircraft from our slim Pacific forces. The B-17s committed to this mission were led by Lieutenant Colonels Walter Sweeney and Brooke Allen. Every last plane would be needed for the impending battle. Once down on Midway after the long flight, with no rest, our crews had to be thrown into immediate patrol duty.
The Japanese fleet, more than 80 warships, advanced. The coded message was authentic. Their task forces divided, some steaming north toward Alaska, the main body converging on Midway. 470 miles west of the island, the battle stage was set when a Navy Catalina spotted the strong enemy task force. But Midway's commander refused to commit American naval or air units until he had more information about the enemy.
Our newly arrived B-17s and B-26s, as well as Marine fighters, were under constant alert. We installed extra gas tanks to increase bomber range. Our crewmen realized that this was going to be the first test of B-17s as a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Some big bomber boys even claimed that B-17s could stop carriers. The 4th of June was the day of the real battle. Minutes after a patrol sighted the enemy, those bombers not yet in the air got going fast. 9 B-17 crews under Colonel Sweeney were joined by 5 from Colonel Allen's squadron. Warmed up and ready for battle, Air Force bombers took off to find the enemy. Rendezvous point was Curie Island, from where our bombers were to proceed west to the target. 100 miles out, our bomber commanders received new orders to change course and go after an enemy carrier force that had broken away from the main fleet and was now launching an attack against our base.
The Japanese dagger, pointed at Midway, was made up of 4 carriers, great battle wagons, many destroyers and transports. The mission of the Imperial carrier planes was to rake the island's gun emplacements and bomb the way for an invasion. Marine vindicators sprang to meet the enemy, and the battle was on.
In the heat of battle, our flag was struck down. Marines quickly repaired the broken staff and ceremoniously raised Old Glory against the backdrop of fire, smoke, and faith. Units of the U.S. Navy, including 3 flat tops, had raced up to Midway. Navy fighters and bombers were wound up and sent off while the Japs were still pounding U.S. defenses. Enemy destroyers and cruisers were the target. Our marauders and fortresses went after enemy carriers. Jap units were like huge magnets attracting Navy planes, Marine dive bombers, and AAF heavies. One B-17 found his target and leveled off. Jap units and American bombers joined the battle. This Jap eddy got through our barrage. It was a free-for-all. Finally, when our Navy and Air Force bombers hammered back at Jap carriers, the issue was decided. First, our bombers attacked from 3,600 feet and then came down to strafe the decks. One by one, the enemy ships caught fire. During the 3-day battle, aside from 8 auxiliary vessels sunk or damaged, Japan lost 4 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, and 3 destroyers, in addition to 275 aircraft and 4,800 men. We had smashed the Jap dagger.
Back at the base, now free from the threat of invasion, the men dug themselves out of the wreckage. A Navy PBY, which had rescued a ditched B-17 crew, now brought them home. The battle ended with Midway's installations, including the hospital, badly wrecked by enemy bombers. Unified under one flag, sailors, Marines, and airmen who had fought side by side now saluted the 92 officers and 215 enlisted men we had lost. All were heroes. In the Battle of Midway, perhaps the most important single engagement of the Pacific Naval War, the airplane at last proved itself a defensive weapon against attacking surface forces. Once again, the AAF had demonstrated its ability to meet the enemy on land, on sea, and in the air. It was planned destiny that the Axis pincers would suffer the crushing blows of the greatest striking force in military history, the United States Air Force. June 1942, New York Harbor. Men of the 8th Air Force, 10,000 strong, prepared to board a single converted luxury liner for England, just as their fathers did a generation before in the AEF Aero Squadrons. This time, the 97th Bomb Group ground crews, 2 fighter groups and their service units were embarking for England. On her maiden troop ship run across the Atlantic, the Queen Elizabeth carried the vanguard of American air power for the new fight against aggression.
In England, at High Wycombe, we used a girls' boarding school as headquarters. Here, 30 miles from Piccadilly, began the build-up, which eventually made the 8th Air Force larger than the entire U.S. Army had been only 3 years before. As the summer of 1942 rushed by, the work of Generals Duncan, Akers, Spots, and the rest of us made the idea a reality. We learned about the air war from the RAF, reaching a degree of cooperation never before equaled by the military forces of 2 great nations.
However, for smashing target Germany, there was disagreement on tactics. The AAF came over prepared for daylight precision bombing, although the British now practiced night area bombing, having suffered unbearably heavy losses in daylight operations. Accordingly, the British Bomber Command picked their targets, trained their crews, fed them lots of carrots, and designed their planes for deadly night attacks. The success of the Wellingtons and Lancasters in attacks against Cologne and the Ruhr during the summer nights of 1942 offered grim evidence of what such tactics could accomplish. These free men were dedicating their lives to attempt the destruction of the economic fabric of an enemy nation in order to save our way of life.
Our first test in tactics came August 17th. It was a critical day for the 8th Bomber Command when we loaded up for the first U.S. raid from England in U.S. planes in daylight. General Ira Aker had told us that the target was the great marshalling yard near Rouen in Nazi-occupied France. There were still plenty of skeptics who predicted dismal results from the first attempt at a daylight mission. Generals Spots and Aker had to prove them wrong. Our morale had worn pretty thin from repeated dry runs and public impatience for American action in the European theater. Each guy acted nonchalant, but we were fully aware of the long-range strategic planning that hinged on this particular mission. Maybe we didn't know any better, but we had plenty of confidence. Confidence in our weapons, confidence in our buddies and the way they did their job. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes, just hot rocks. But heroes or not, the flying privates, sergeants, and generals were putting their lives on the line, knowing full well what the odds were. At the controls of one of the lead ships was the old man himself, General Aker, flying a B-17, which someone aptly named Yankee Doodle. As the bombers pulled up their gear, American flyers and 12 American machines assembled over the British countryside, ready to test an American idea in France, high-altitude precision bombing. As England disappeared behind us, we took up battle stations. Our bombardiers and gunners knew that the fate of the mission and the lives of the crew depended on them. We took turns manning the guns, expecting opposition. One of the crew pointed out the city of Rouen, where Joan of Arc had died for the liberation of France. Now, airplanes named Baby Doll, Peggy D, and Yankee Doodle were spoiling to fight for the same thing.
German warning centers, caught by surprise, didn't report the fortresses until they were well on their way to the target.
We made a direct run for a point about 3 miles north of Rouen, and then a slight turn to the right for the bombing approach. All of us flying this first U.S. bomber raid wondered why the sky was clear of enemy fighters and flak. Visibility was excellent, something you don't get for night bombing. All 12 planes dropped a total of 37,000 pounds of bombs. Then we met flak. Daylight gave the Jerrys better targets, too. They pumped anti-aircraft shells smack up to our altitude. Two of our planes collected some flak. Then 40 German fighters made the picture complete. These were no tow targets. These babies throw lead back at you. When we finally shook off the enemy attack, I took a reading. Our group was intact. The mission was far more successful than many of us had dared hope. Even British Bomber Command Air Chief Marshal Harris sent General Aker enthusiastic congratulations. Yankee Doodle, he said, certainly went to town and can stick another well-deserved feather in his cap.
One month later, halfway around the world, events in New Guinea took charge of plans. The Japanese drive toward Port Moresby, one of the few bases we still held north of Australia, threatened to push the Allies into the sea. To stop the enemy, General MacArthur quickly reset the stage for an Allied offensive. He relied on General George Kenny, new commander of Allied Air, who is reorganizing the 5th Air Force with fresh spirit and ideas. The urgency of the situation led him to a daring experiment in air tactics. Moving an army by air had worked in the Carolina maneuvers. Why not in New Guinea? MacArthur had ordered troops rushed into battle. One regiment took 36 hours to go by water. A battalion took 5 weeks by foot. But 60 planes carried an entire Australian infantry battalion in one day. In a little more than an hour, fresh and rested troops arrived in combat zones, ready for immediate duty in the Papuan campaign. With the troops came equipment. By mid-November, 10,000 American and Australian troops had been carried over the mountains. To support the men, air transport brought in supplies at the rate of 2 million pounds a week. They eventually brought in enough men, rations, ammunition, artillery, and equipment to feed and protect themselves, do battle with the enemy, and build airfields. Specially designed airborne equipment, such as pint-sized bulldozers and graders, helped us lay out 6 airstrips in the Kunai Flats. Without native labor paid at local union rates, the work of building grass strips could never have been accomplished. Around Dabadura, they scraped out runways less than 16 miles from the front. Construction completed, fighter units moved in fast to protect the operation. And so the Southwest Pacific Air Forces, directed by veteran Air Leader George Kenny and Fighter Commander Ennis Whitehead, had forged a tactical weapon which helped stem the tide of Japanese aggression in the Papuan campaign.
The one airplane we fighter pilots in New Guinea wanted was the P-38. We had begged Washington to spare us a few of these high-flying Speedy Lightnings. When we finally got them, the ground crews had a big job on their hands. Fuel tanks, superchargers, armament, all required major adjustment or repair.
Enemy mechanics on neighboring fields had fewer planes than the Allies, but numbers in the South Pacific didn't tell everything. Back in October, General Kenny had warned the Pentagon, the Jap is 2 days from the factory to the combat zone, and he may swarm all over me. On December 27th, the Jap tried.
About 11:30 hours, they gave us the alert. Fort Moresby had received the word that our radio station at Dabadura had picked up a plot of enemy aircraft approaching the Buna area. We pilots had waited a long time for this moment, and with the help of our crew chief, we got going in a hurry. It had taken more than 3 months to get the P-38s ready for combat. Our maintenance boys had worked hard, and now we were about to put the Lightnings to the test. As part of the 39th Fighter Squadron, we had flown some patrol and escort missions. However, this was to be our first important combat operation. 12 brand new P-38s were being dispatched to intercept an invading force of unknown strength. Both sides were in for a surprise. At 12:10 hours, we sighted the Japs. They were out in force. Separating into 3 flights of 4 each, we got on top at 10,000 feet. The Zeros didn't appreciate the view. Our lead flight peeled off to dive in and break up the formation. With his throttle wide open, this P-38 jockey latched onto a Jap. Then the first lightning struck. One of the eager beavers in action that day was a moon-faced lieutenant by the name of Richard Fogg. This was the first of Fogg's 40 victories. Captain Thomas Lynch was also there, and that was a good thing, because the enemy force included more than 28 Zeros and bombers. Tommy Lynch got 2 more that day, making him the 39th Squadron's first ace.
When the score was finally added up, our 12 Lightnings had shot down 11 enemy fighters and bombers. Thus, the P-38 made a dramatic debut in the Southwest Pacific. The tide was turning, but one battle didn't win a war. There were still brutal weeks and months and years of war ahead. Later chapters will show that the enemy had not yet seen, felt, nor imagined the awful might of the air power to be unleashed by the United States Air Force. November 8, 1942, the Mediterranean. 11 months after Pearl Harbor, more than 800 ships engaged in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. The plan called for tactical air support for the ground forces. Some of the air units were ferried from England and the States by carriers.
We had 70 Warhawks on a U.S. flat top, 25 more on a British carrier. We liked this plane. The Curtiss P-40 could carry a 500-pound bomb as easily as a belly gas tank. It was both a fighter and a bomber. Now, inspired by Doolittle's Tokyo raid, land-trained fighter pilots, because their planes were urgently needed, were risking carrier takeoffs to get to Morocco. At 2- and 3-minute intervals, we raced down the short deck and grabbed for air. Felt like someone pulled the runway out from under us awful fast. We cleared the decks and buzzed the carriers for luck. Then the entire group, led by Colonel Bill Momeyer, headed for the already battle-scarred landing fields of French Morocco. General Eisenhower came up for a look-see at our forward command post. Allied forces had rolled over the opposition and moved halfway across North Africa, only to grind to a halt because of weather and the lack of supplies. We were almost within sight of the enemy's big supply ports in Tunisia. However, logistics and mud dictated the decision. On General Eisenhower's order, positions were consolidated and the attack was postponed indefinitely. The mountains, the roads, even the air seemed to ooze with 6 weeks of steady rain. No motor transportation. Wheels went no place. Only a few meager supplies got through. For once, like the foot soldier, air support, the umbrella for our ground forces, was stuck in the mud.
The enemy was in much better shape. They had hundreds of planes operating from permanent all-weather fields. Their veteran, battle-trained Luftwaffe was sure of easy victory over inexperienced American air units. Allied harbors and airfields were primary targets. Air defenses were weak, open for Stuka dive bombing and strafing. After plastering Allied supply harbors, they attacked airfields. Air units doggedly held on while even the ground seemed to rise and burn under repeated attacks. The Allies suffered losses, and even as they rescued their wounded, new and faster ways were improvised to carry casualties to safety. The planes which had brought in high-priority supplies took out higher-priority men. They were attended by flight nurses. With their evacuation, casualties were only hours from hospitals, even home. But wounded men and planes had to be repaired. American ingenuity went to work. Salvaged parts and new ideas made crude gasoline firebombs. The Allies rebuilt their strength.
General Ike had planned strategy with his air, ground, and naval officers. We worked out the best ways of using our combined forces. General Spots was named CO of the Northwest African Air Force. Generals Arnold, Royce, and Brereton visited our outfit, the 12th Air Force Fighter Command, run by General Pete Quesada. The brass were helping us get on even terms with the Luftwaffe. Army transport boys tripled railway capacity. A while back, we'd nearly run out of 500-pounders, but now we had plenty. Gasoline rationed at home meant life or death in the desert. The battle for supply was being won. We were getting ready.
Suddenly, on February 14th, Rommel's Africa Corps attacked. At Kasserine Pass, Allied lines stiffened. After 8 days of attack, the Axis initiative was exhausted. It was at this point that Rommel quit his African command.
For the enemy, the situation worsened. Gasoline shortages reduced air operations. Squeezed into a steadily smaller pocket, they prepared to evacuate planes and key personnel to Sicily. About 20 men could escape in a Junker 52.
High above them, the Allies watched and waited. Something big was coming. The German escape plan was put in motion. Near Tunis rose a group of more than 30 heavily armored Me-109 fighters. They were to escort a large fleet of slow-flying 52s. The hop to Sicily was a shuttle run of about 100 miles, less than an hour. 100 strong, the transport stretched in a long line on the deck, headed for their Sicilian sanctuary.
They didn't get very far. As soon as our 57th Fighter Group spotted them, Captain Jimmy Curl's squad of 13 P-40s dove on the enemy to split them up. had been chasing Germans since July 1942, but we never had a chance like this famous afternoon. Down below, the transports droned on. If their luck held, the Germans might make a getaway. Their luck ran out. The tail-end Charlies of the long escape line took their chances on getting back to their Cape Bon airdrome. Some of them made it, the hard way. When the attack was over, we had destroyed 58 transports and 18 fighters. Lieutenants Duffy, Powers, and Cleveland each clobbered 5 transports. From then on, we sat over German airdromes and dared the Luftwaffe to come up.
But the Axis still had a trump card. The Africa Corps blocked the way to Tunis. The Allies probed, seeking weak spots. Finding some, they shifted forces, building for a breakthrough. Montgomery's army hammered the Africa Corps from the south. Allied artillery tried to give the ground forces a toehold on the corridor to Tunis. But Monty's 8th Army was effectively pinned down by the Africa Corps.
On the morning of May 6th, they called for tactical air support. Weather was good. We had gasoline and bombs, planes and men. We were ready. The Northwest African Tactical Air Force drew up a schedule for an unprecedented wave of air attack. The heavies were first to give depth to the artillery barrage. They ordered us to concentrate on an area 4 miles long by 3.5 miles wide. We had 12th Air Force bomber boys who had started in the muddy fields of Algeria. They were teamed up with 9th Air Force men who had eaten sand all the way from Egypt, 1,500 miles. Before 9 o'clock, we had planned to fly more than 1,000 sorties. Anything that could take off went up to the corridor. Our fighter-bomber boys, including the 57th Group of Cape Bon fame, were about to sweep a road to Tunis. We were using the experience gained in Egypt, smashing Rommel at El Alamein. Then we were only a few. Now we were hundreds, all grouped in a powerful package. General Alexander's armies were anxious for the air attack, which would mean a breakthrough. They didn't have long to wait. We blasted a channel from Medjez El Bab to Tunis. In 2 hours, tanks and infantry had advanced as much as a mile. Resistance began to crack. Firebombs, which we had tested in the Sahara, helped in the big show. The Germans, realizing their desperate situation, retreated to make a last-ditch stand.
Finally, the Allied armies broke through. From here on, Alexander mopped up with fire. At last, the Allies could see Tunis. This was the first flush of victory. A year and a half after Pearl Harbor, only 6 months after the landing. Allied soldiers, tankmen, and airmen were liberators, like the American Marines who had brought peace to North Africa more than a century before. were salutes to liberty as tyranny disappeared. The citizens of Tunis cheered the crusade for freedom, but now had a new champion, Allied air power. 250,000 prisoners proved that Nazi invincibility was a myth. In the German defeat, we learned the strength of joint unified command. Allied air power had destroyed enemy planes, guns, and ships, which paved the way for the final destruction of Hitler's once proud and powerful Africa Corps. As designer of the Tunisian victory, General Eisenhower reviewed the United Allies who were at last upon the march. The world had seen the first large-scale application of complete air supremacy. We had battle-tested and developed tactical air support for our ground forces. Later chapters will show the lessons of North African air warfare applied on a global scale with the steadily increasing manpower, plane power, and firepower of the United States Air Force.